I was not expecting to do another response video so soon, but this came to my attention and I couldn't ignore it. Now, Metatron and Shad have already debunked this video very thoroughly, and I am in no way superior to those two titans. In fact, I thought about not doing this at all because I thought if they've already done it so well, what on earth could I possibly add? I mean, I kind of didn't even want to at first, but I thought about it and I decided the only reason I'm looking at this video is because Shadversity's video is great, but it's over an hour long, and I know some of y'all out there aren't as interested as I am to watch an hour-long breakdown of something like this. Metatron did a fantastic job too in about 23 minutes, but he mostly picked specific moments in the video to break down the factual inaccuracies, and I will do the same thing, but I also want to analyze and mock the ludicrous logic presented in this video, because I think that there are some things that I just want to say. I couldn't ignore this. As much as I really tried to, I couldn't ignore this. Today, we're looking at a video from the channel Weird History, where they tell us why wearing medieval armor was actually more dangerous than wearing nothing at all. Yes, you heard that right. You know how we like to make fun of Raider and For Honor for having literally no chest protection? Apparently we had it wrong the whole time. Lawbringer is the fool for wearing too much armor. Who knew? Again, I actually don't know much about this channel. I've never watched Weird History. I don't know how accurate they usually are, or how correct or reliable they usually are, so I can't talk about the channel as a whole in terms of something that this is normal for them. But considering I've never heard of them up until now, and this video has gotten the attention of both Shad and Metatron, I have to assume this is kind of out of the norm for them, or something so egregiously bad that it got people's attention. So I'll watch some of their channel later and see if they have better takes in the future, but for now, let's begin.
Chainmail tunics and suits of shining armor were some of the most recognizable parts of medieval warfare. They've become somewhat legendary for their striking appearance on the battlefield. But were they really all that? Well, today we're going to take a look at several ways medieval armor was more dangerous than just wearing nothing. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, we'd be much obliged if you would leave a comment and let us know what other medieval topics you would like to hear about. Okay, time to call your squire and suit up, because we're about to go to war with some weird history. As early as the Bronze Age, ancient Greek soldiers were wearing plate armor that was mostly designed to protect the chest and lower limbs, like the dendra panoply, which shielded the wearer's entire torso and neck beneath plates of bronze. The arms, however, were pretty much on their own in this situation. By the time of classical antiquity, lighter and less restrictive armor like the muscle cuirass would become widespread. Designs continued to evolve, and by the 1st century BCE, soldiers in the Roman army were wearing plate armor in the form of the lorica segmentata. Over time, the number of plates in the areas of the body being protected slowly increased, and by about 1420 CE, Europeans had created the earliest full-body suits of armor. And by the 15th and 16th centuries, every European army was built around plate-armored soldiers. The fullest sets of armor tended to be made for jousting rather than warfare. That was the glamour armor. Though this period represented the height of full-body plate armor being used in warfare, the reason we associate knights with armor today has more to do with specialized jousting armor developed for tournaments in the 16th century. Wearing a blocky jousting suit wouldn't have made much sense in a battle, because your movement and vision would be extremely limited, but it worked fine for a skirmish against your fellow knights. After all, getting impaled while playing a game? Nobody wants to be that guy. It's the medieval equivalent of getting injured in the preseason. But while a plate metal bodysuit would shield soldiers from many types of battlefield damage, it far from made them invincible, and created many more problems than it solved.
Well, not a lot of problems with this first section here. A lot of what they say is pretty close to accurate, except for a few minor things, like how they said that all medieval warfare centered on full-body plate mail at one point, which it really didn't. You see, it depended on the wealth of the knight, how many knights were present on the battlefield, and the wealth of the armies. Wealthier and more equipped knights might have more plate mail, while lesser knights might not be able to afford all of it, but that's just a small nitpick in the grand scheme of things. We have far more to discuss here.
Between 1096 and 1291 CE, Christians and Muslims engaged in a series of religious wars known as the Crusades. Perhaps you've heard of them. These wars were primarily fought over control of various holy sites that both sides considered sacred, and most of the action went down in the Middle East. Now, if you know anything about the Crusades, then you probably know they were an incredibly bloody period for everybody involved. After all, we're talking about nearly 2 centuries of non-stop violent conflict. And if that wasn't bad enough already, keep in mind that many of the combatants were fighting each other in the desert while wearing heavy metal suits. At this point, you may be thinking something like, hey, won't applying intense heat to a metal container just cook whatever's inside it? Good question. And the answer is yes. Soldiers were literally baked inside their armor, and many eventually perished from heat exhaustion. Luckily, they discovered ways to get around the heat. Some took their armor off entirely when it became too warm. That was obviously the most effective solution, but could leave one vulnerable if fighting broke out. Others discovered that covering up armor with cloth prevented direct sunlight from heating the metal up to the cooking point. Of course, now they were wearing a heavy metal suit and a jacket in the blazing desert heat. Not exactly the time or place to layer up. War is hell, man.
Okay, several things to say here. Firstly, can we just take a moment to laugh at the fact that you're using a very specific period of knight history to justify a problem? What about knights who fought in more temperate or cold climates? Would this issue not apply there? Would it not receive a mention? But let's move on from that. Firstly, full-body plate mail was not worn during the Crusades in the Holy Land. Most soldiers wore chainmail, gambeson, and cloth. They learned from the Islamic warriors how to better fight against the desert heat. Also, you make it sound like knights just never took off their armor because it was too dangerous to, but they didn't need to wear it all the time. Also, you make fun of them for layering up as it would make them hotter, but you do know that in a desert it's good to cover up because any exposed skin will get burned, right? I mean, even anime understands that. One Piece understands that. And it's a show about pirates. Look!
We're finally here! Wow, so we're going into the desert? Does anyone know how hot it's supposed to get?
Over 100 degrees in the daytime.
What? Please tell me you're joking!
Ah, Nami, what happened? Where's your dancer outfit? Ah, you too! Vivi, why are you wearing that?
Because any exposed skin will get sunburned. You have to cover up in the desert.
But those outfits were so sexy.
Put these on, Luffy.
Oh, thank you.
Look, you can mock them if you want to, but the knights had answers to heat.
In its heyday, plated armor made a soldier about as close to invincible as they could ever get. Sword slashes did absolutely nothing to it, which meant fighters had to get very clever to get their cuts in. The trick to defeating an opponent in plated armor was knowing that the armor didn't truly cover everything. There were gaps that one could exploit near the groin, in the neck, and under the armpits. Man, seems like you'd want extra armor in a few of those places. Given this particular weakness, resourceful fighters would grapple their opponents and then try to stab at those weak points with daggers. If you're the guy wearing the armor, that would often mean taking a dagger in an extremely inopportune place, like the neck, the groin, or even through the eye slit in your helmet. Whichever it turned out to be, the one thing that was for sure was that it would be an exceptionally painful end.
Okay, let's apply this logic for a moment. Okay, you argue that knights had gaps in the armor that could be exploited like the groin, neck, and armpits. Well, firstly, that depends highly on the kind of armor you're wearing. Some helmets could cover the throat, some armor pieces did defend the groin, and lots of knights wore chainmail or gambeson under their armor to add an extra layer of protection for such instances. But let's pretend for just a moment that there is no protection there. That those are genuinely exposed places where a knight is vulnerable and they have no armor there. Let's apply that logic for a moment. Those are 4 points an enemy could strike. Let's compare that, though, to wearing no armor. How many openings do I have then? I mean, do I actually need to sit down and lay this out for you? Do we need to put up a diagram of a person who's naked versus a diagram of an armored warrior and point out all the different places you could hit on an armored warrior versus the everywhere you can hit on a naked guy? If I'm wearing armor, my enemy might be able to grapple me and slide a knife between my armor plates. But if I'm not wearing armor, they don't even need to try that hard. They can just stab me in the chest, face, back, or limbs. Look, I would rather make it harder for my enemy to get the blows in than just giving them free exposed flesh to strike. Sure, absolutely, a stab to the throat or groin would be excruciatingly painful. But since those are the only areas to be concerned about, I will know to guard those places better. I don't need to worry about protecting the rest of my body because, guess what? My armor is guarding it for me. Your logic literally doesn't make sense here. And again, like I said earlier, Most knight armors had answers to that. Chainmail underneath the armor, riveted layers of metal, different levels of or layers of plate mail armor. Certain parts of the armor did have possible groin protectors or back of the leg protectors or armpit protectors. Those things could exist, and it depends highly on the kind of armor you're wearing. So, yeah, this makes no sense. Moving on.
Considering that suits of armor were basically huge chunks of steel strapped to a person's body, you'd probably assume they would be extremely restrictive. And in some ways that was true. But you might be surprised by just how much mobility some of these knights had. They could actually run and jump surprisingly well for a tin can with legs.
Run away! Run away!
That being said, the plates were still an encumbrance. While you did have a decent amount of mobility in a suit of armor, that didn't mean you could just sprint around on the battlefield swinging your sword like a larper in a cardboard costume. In fact, a full suit of armor could weigh up to 100 pounds or more.
Okay, I gotta stop here. Shadiversity said it best when he pointed out that you can debunk this claim with a mere 3-second Google search. Full plate armor, on average, could weigh about 25 kilos. That's around 55 to 60 pounds. And bear in mind, you're not talking about jousting armor anymore. You're talking about armor meant for battle. This bit is factually false. It is 100% wrong. I'm baffled you'd say that and get that so flagrantly wrong. Metatron pointed it out. Shadiversity pointed it out. I'm pointing it out. This is false.
And that's not counting the rest of the typical gear a soldier might have to carry around with him. Like, for instance, a sword. As you can imagine, donning a bulky pile of metal to swing a smaller, pointier piece of metal at your foes could get pretty tiring pretty quickly. It meant you often found yourself facing opponents who were potentially far less exhausted than you were. Thanks to contemporary reenactors, historians estimate that running in 15th century chainmail armor required twice the amount of energy than running without it. Picture trying to run an obstacle course with a full-size man riding on your back, like Yoda. That's kind of what fighting in a suit of armor was like. Nowhere was that more consequential than in the Battle of Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt was a conflict between the English and the French, famously immortalized in Shakespeare's Henry V. In the play, Henry rallies his troops to victory by giving one of the bard's most famous soliloquies, the St. Crispin's Day speech.
From this day to the ending of the world!
In real life, the French lost due to factors that were less than poetic and more logistical. One of those factors was the weather. It had rained for 2 straight weeks beforehand, turning the ground into a field of mud. Marching through that churned dirt in 100 pounds of armor sapped a lot of the French troops' strength before they even reached the fight. While that doesn't make Henry's speech any less inspiring, the English had a bit more of an advantage than old Hank let on.
Okay, I love the fact that you're using carrying Yoda as an example as to what it might have been like to carry armor on your back, because do you know why Luke had Yoda on his back? Training. Weight training. Imagine for a moment that you lift a 20-pound weight 50 times a day for 3 months straight. By month 4, I'll bet you don't notice the weight that much anymore, because you're used to it. You built up muscle strength. You trained yourself to handle the weight. Yes, armor weighed more and it could restrict movement to a degree, but that was the cost of its protection. I'd rather have a suit of armor that keeps me alive but makes me a little less mobile than nothing at all where my only option is to run for my life. Plus, armor was weight distributed to help weight distribute throughout the body so it's not all resting on your shoulders. And not only this, but you bring up Agincourt. You do know that marching through muddy, wet terrain would tire out any army. Not just armies in armor, right? The French were tired, exhausted, fighting an almost uphill battle against an already entrenched and prepared enemy. But you want to know the funny thing about all that? We love to look at the Battle of Agincourt and go, oh, look at how useless that armor was against the obviously superior English longbowmen. Do you know who won the 100 Years' War? The French. In fact, it's a common joke among the French people. We won the dang war, but no one will talk about that. They only want to talk about our loss at Agincourt. It's actually very funny. We love to praise and sing about the longbows of Agincourt, but we don't talk about the fact that the French still won the overall war. It's kind of funny that way. But speaking of bows and arrows,
one of the deadliest weapons of medieval combat was the trusty old bow and arrow. While it's true that armor could protect its wearer from arrows, it hardly made you immune from them. First and foremost, distance was a huge factor. From a long distance, arrows wouldn't do too much. But at a closer range, arrows designed to pierce armor could smash right through. The advent of the English longbow was an especially dangerous development, as it had stronger power and longer range. These bows were over 6 feet long, and in the right hands, they were capable of killing a target 200 yards away. They also drastically reduced reload time. A skilled longbowman could fire half a dozen arrows in the same time a crossbowman could fire a single bolt. Anyone relying on armor plates to save them from the occasional lucky shot could easily find themselves lit up like Sonny Corleone by a longbowman. Time to call on the cavalry, Santino. Speaking of the cavalry, a strategic cavalry charge could often be the deciding factor in a fight, even against combatants decked out in full plate armor, like zombie Gregor Clegane. One reason for this is that horses could deliver an incredibly powerful blow to virtually any defensive formation. But more pointedly, the riders carried lances, which were long poles with incredibly sharp metal tips, specially designed to pierce armor, and they were incredibly effective. With the power of a galloping horse behind it, a lance could punch a hole through RoboCop, let alone any knights on the battlefield. Along with the lance, other weapons designed to take advantage of the weak points in suits of armor included the long-tapered sword, halberds, poleaxes, and polearms.
Okay, there's this real issue that happens when discussing medieval weaponry, and it reminds me a lot of what Noggin and MatPat did in their For Honor videos. It's this thing where you essentially assume that some weapons could just easily do something like punch through armor by virtue of the fact that they were potentially capable of it. Like saying a cunabo could easily take out a knight if hit in the right way. Okay? Easily. That's not a correct term there. Or they might say a bow and arrow could be fired directly at the neck. It could, but that's not a guarantee. It's kind of like this whole rock, paper, scissors idea in the head. Basically, my scissors will always beat your paper. My rock will always beat your scissors. You know, that kind of thing where you just say, this thing will always beat this other thing. And that's not true. Yes, there are cases of some lances or arrows punching through armor or killing people through gaps or exposed points in their armor due to lucky shots. That's why longbowmen probably fired from up close more often, because they could more easily aim for those spots or open places. But the argument of a lance or polearm punching through armor just naturally? No. Is it capable of doing it? Possibly, but that's an if. If there are factors that need to be considered, these are it. Like, did it hit the armor square on, or did it glance it? Did the man in the armor step out of the way? Were they carrying a shield? Did the horse run with enough speed? Was the warrior knocked backwards, or did they hold their ground? All of these factors can change the outcome of that blow. A halberd or pole weapon has the potential to puncture plate mail, but that doesn't mean it will every time, and even if it does, it doesn't guarantee that the blow will be a death blow. No battle is a surefire thing. Armor is designed to improve your chances of survival. It doesn't mean you're invincible. It means it improves your chances. If there are weapons out there that just naturally overpower and can break through armor every single time with no effort, like this is the one weapon, like, you know what, you pull this, your armor's obsolete, then the armor would either be improved to accommodate or it would cease to be used. Considering that they still used it despite these weapons existing, I'm guessing those weapons you mentioned didn't always get results. In fact, Metatron even brings up a great point, like at the Battle of Agincourt, the fight you mentioned. Even though the English longbowmen did play a significant factor in defeating the French, there were many surrendering French noblemen. There were lots of surrendering soldiers, meaning that not all of the arrows killed all of the knights, meaning there were cases where some lived and some arrows did not puncture the armor. Yeah, armor did its job there.
The helmets that completed a suit of armor were incredibly adept at protecting one's head. Unfortunately, that protection came at the price of completely eliminating your peripheral vision. Sort of like how a diving mask lets you see underwater, but only the sharks directly in front of you. In the midst of combat, it could be pretty easy to get taken out by an attacker creeping up behind you, before you even knew they were there. Luckily for those wearing the helmets, this didn't happen too often, due to the way military formations tended to work at the time. But when combatants got really mixed in with one another, Braveheart style, a distinct possibility in any battle, a soldier in armor could get absolutely bushwhacked by someone just outside their limited field of vision.
No, they wouldn't get bushwhacked. Want to know why they wouldn't get bushwhacked? Simple. Armor. If I don't see the guy hitting me from the side with their sword, I'll feel it bounce off my armor, I'll turn around, gut him, and feel better about myself. Now, as for the limited vision thing, it depends on the kind of helmet you are wearing and the circumstances. If it's a cavalry charge where the enemy is firing arrows at you, a face mask will be helpful because vision isn't as essential as protection and keeping the momentum of the charge going. But once in the fighting, you might remove the visor or lift up the visor to see better. There were also some helmets designed more for breathing and vision so you could see and move quicker. Also, this whole thing where two armies just crash into each other in a mad barbaric brawl like you were showing with Braveheart rarely happened. There were battle formations, battle tactics, and techniques the knights picked up from the Romans or used themselves. It wasn't just this mad brawl. You wouldn't see that. I mean, you might see it, but it would not be common. That's not the typical medieval tactic.
While a heavy suit of plate armor would protect you from most stabbing and slashing damage, it could actually make it easier for your opponent to clobber you into the next world by increasing your chances of getting a concussion or internal bleeding after sustaining a massive blow. Weapons like maces and hammers took advantage of the fact that steel could dent and cave into its wearer. Obviously, teeing off a foe's head with a heavy blunt weapon could still do plenty of damage, even if they were wearing a helmet. But if swung with enough force, a hammer could actually damage a chest plate enough to break bones, cause internal bleeding, or even stop someone's heart. The trick is having enough strength to make the blow count. But when you're talking about professional soldiers of the medieval era, that kind of strength wasn't all that unusual.
Okay, and this might be the dumbest part of the video yet. I mean, the logic here is absurd. Absolutely ridiculous. Okay, it's actually kind of mind-boggling. Let me try to break this down point by point. First, you argue that helmets increase the likelihood of concussions due to head trauma. Well, yes, that's true. In fact, did you know that in World War II, there were far more head injuries as a result of helmets? Yeah, that's true. So I guess that means, by that logic, we should just get rid of helmets, right? Well, before you throw helmets in the garbage, do you want to know what there were fewer of as a result of helmets? There were fewer death by headshot. Yeah, concussions are a thing you risk when wearing a helmet because you're going to get your head rattled from a blow to the head. But you know what? I'd much rather get a concussion than get my head bashed into my shoulders. I'd rather have some ringing and mild head trauma and survive than be killed. I mean, my God, your video is supposed to be explaining why armor is dangerous to wear, but from the way I'm seeing it, the alternative is worse. You haven't explained why wearing nothing is a better alternative. You're simply saying, oh, well, because you wear armor, this could happen and you might die from it. You've said nothing to support why your argument is valid. Metatron points out that most helmets had padding or lining on the inside to help deal with the concussion hits of head blows. But again, I think the point should be made. Helmets might result in concussions, but they tend to protect against head death. Would you tell a football player or a firefighter or a modern soldier to just get rid of their helmet? Are you nuts? By that logic, why wear helmets? Oh my gosh, you shouldn't wear that helmet. Why not? You could get a concussion. Well, I wouldn't want that. Go out and play football and just have your head cracked open as you slam into the other guy. Well, gosh, you should have had some kind of head protection. Have a soldier go out with his helmet. Hey, you should take that off. You could get a concussion if a bullet hits it. That's a good point, Sarge. Take off the helmet, gets a bullet right through his eye. Man, you should have had something to protect your head there. Are you? I'm trying to wrap my mind around this, and I'm just struggling here. You then argue that armor could be dented by heavy weapons, and this could break a rib and could puncture the heart and kill you. Well, you know what? I suppose that is true. If a warhammer hit me square in the chest and it dented my armor, that could break my rib, that could pierce my heart, that could kill me. Yeah, I grant you, that could happen. But wait, if I'm not wearing armor and that guy hits me square in the chest without armor, what do you think will happen then? Maybe I will definitely die. You see, when it comes to the question of armor versus no armor, it's the question of I might die versus I will definitely die. I think I will take the might die every day. I would rather take that chance of I might get out of this alive rather than I am going to get killed. If the guy with the hammer hits me in the chest, there is the possibility it will lead to a death. If I'm not wearing armor, I'm almost guaranteed a death. Okay, you then say that it required enough strength to make that happen. But soldiers of the medieval era were plenty strong enough to do that kind of damage. And you're right here. They were strong. They were trained soldiers. So doesn't that kind of debunk your own argument earlier about the cumbersome nature of armor and how it naturally wears out the wearer easily? I love it when they debunk themselves. They make it so easy. Look, here's the reality, dude. Just gonna be real. If I'm a knight and I come home from war, I stagger back home from the war, bloody, armor dented, helmet bashed in, sword nearly broken from overuse, my shield battered, my leg twisted, and my armor broken in a few places. Yes, I got beat up, my armor's caved in, I am injured in a serious way. And I've got a concussion from my head getting dinged around in that helmet. But I lived. I survived. I got out. What about the dude who took all the same punishment I did who wore no armor? That is a serious question I want answered. You can talk about how armor had its potential risks, but compare that to the person who wore nothing. And before you say that's an unfair comparison, the title of this video is Armor is So Dangerous, You're Better Off Wearing Nothing. So you better explain to me why wearing nothing is the superior option. You haven't, and I have yet to hear any argument as to why. Do you think that people who wear no armor are more likely to come home alive? Of course not. But your video is arguing that armor is so dangerous it's better not to wear it at all. All of your points thus far, particularly at this point, seem to be wearing armor sounds nice, but you run the risk to be potentially killed if you wear it. You are right. I could potentially be killed. But the alternative you're proposing, wearing nothing at all, provides a far worse prospect. I will be killed. If I take the same blow that I took wearing armor without armor, I am much more likely to die. Your logic makes me wonder what you were thinking when making this video. No, I'm not joking. I want to be nice here. I don't want to be mean, but your logic is baffling. This isn't even a contrarian talking point. This isn't even one of those talking points where people say that knights were evil or something. We can discuss the morality of the knights. That's a fine discussion point because we can actually analyze certain knight actions. But arguing against armor and saying wearing nothing is better, that's not even contrarian. It makes no sense.
By the 17th century, suits of armor were on the decline. While they remained common among the nobility and cuirassiers during the European wars of religion, by the start of the 18th century, the once glorified suit of armor had basically been reduced to a chest plate. Why? Well, the short answer is guns. The wide proliferation of flintlock muskets, which could easily penetrate armor at a great distance, eventually made plate armor all but obsolete. Napoleon's cavalry experimented with forms of chestplate armor, and it even made a brief but mostly ineffectual reappearance during the U.S. Civil War. Soldiers in World War II wore flak jackets designed to protect against fragments of high-explosive weaponry, though they weren't typically effective against bullets fired from rifles and handguns. Starting in the 1950s, so-called bulletproof vests began to be manufactured using synthetic fibers like boron carbide, silicon carbide, or aluminum oxide, as opposed to steel plates. Starting in 1971, these vests started being made almost exclusively from a material developed by DuPont called Kevlar. Kevlar remains the standard for body armor right up to today, worn by modern soldiers, police officers, and certain interpretations of Batman.
Here I am.
So what do you...
Okay. I could explain that the decline of armor wasn't about guns being better than armor. In fact, flintlock weaponry was actually not always effective against armor, and as guns became more modern, some armors were designed to be thicker and stronger as a result. I could also explain that one of the primary reasons why armor faded from use was the cost of armor. It was far cheaper to manufacture guns than it was to craft fitted and powerful armor that was stronger, not because guns just naturally were better at the time. But I won't explain any of that. I don't need to. I don't need to explain that stuff because your video, quite frankly, just shot itself in the foot. I'm not joking. This whole segment just shot your entire argument in the foot. Your video premise is that armor is so dangerous you might as well not wear it. Only here to explain how in the modern day we are still wearing and improving our armor from what existed back then. You literally break down the timeline of how we went from medieval plate mail armor to a single chest plate armor that was strong but not always effective, to different kinds of armor that was worn during the Civil War, to flak armor, to bulletproof chest armor. You are showing the progression of armor. Humanity learned from the knights long ago that it is beneficial to wear clothing or suits that are designed to keep you alive longer stronger, just like the knights learned from the Romans, and the Romans learned from every civilization they fought, and those civilizations learned from the civilizations before them. You know what they all learned? Armor is a good thing. Yes, the suit might be cumbersome, might be hard to make, and might look silly sometimes, but we continue to find new ways to better protect ourselves. There was never a point where humanity said, come on guys, armor, really? This knight armor thing? Totally ineffective. In fact, it's more dangerous to wear that stuff if you think about it. Let's just forget about armor altogether. What good does it even do? The knight armor was suitable for what was needed at the time. In an age where swords, spears, and axes were the primary means of combat, armor was created to help protect from those weapons. But now that swords have been faded out for the use of modern guns, we abandoned the armor that could not cut it, and now we use armor that does. That does not mean the armor of the past is less useful for its time. It means the new armor has been developed for a new age. No armor is absolutely invincible. No armor will protect you from everything, and no armor is without its weaknesses. But any armor, yes, even plate mail today, grants some percentage of a higher likelihood of survival if worn. If I were in, let's create a hypothetical. If I were in a medieval museum, right, and a guy busts into the museum and starts pointing around a modern handgun, threatening to shoot me, and the only thing I had to protect myself was a suit of 16th century medieval plate mail armor, even though I know against this modern handgun it won't do me much good, I will still take my chances and put on the armor. Why? Because even though it likely won't stop a modern bullet, even though it probably isn't going to do me much good, it is still the better alternative than ripping off my shirt and saying, "Give me your best shot." And that was the mentality of the knights as well. Was their armor foolproof? No, but it was far better than wearing nothing at all, and it increased the likelihood of coming home alive. Guys, this video was awful. Just awful. Now again, I don't know what Weird History's channel is like overall. I don't know if this is par for the course for them, or if this is just a really bad take. It's hard to say. But I saw Shadversity's video of it, and he debunked it even more thoroughly than I did with far more information. So I will leave his link in the description if you're up for watching an hour and 13 minutes of Shad breaking down point by point by point of everything that they got wrong. And if you'd rather watch a shorter version where someone just breaks down the really bad takes, go check out Metatron's video. I'll leave that in the description too. It's shorter, but it's just as good and just as informative. I loved both videos. And again, I wasn't going to make this, but I thought about it and realized I have to give my 2 cents to this. This is so absurd. I had to look at it. Please don't harass the creators. Please don't harass Weird History. I hold no ill will against them. I know nothing about them to hold ill will, but just based on this video alone, I have to say this was a terrible take and kind of surprising coming from a channel that seemed to be teaching history. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in my next one. Take care.